In this video, we're going to create a new instance of the PI interface for relational databases, also called the RDBMSPI interface, and connect it to its PI server and verify its connection to the relational database that it will be getting its data from. To start off with our configuration, we have 3 servers. The first one is Peanut, the PI interface node. This is where we'll install the new instance of the interface. My second server is Walnut. This is my PI server. My third server is called Chestnut. This is my relational database server, and I have a SQL Server installed here with the database that I want to get data from. Going back to Peanut, I'm going to get started by going to the Start menu and selecting the PI Interface Configuration utility. This will help me configure my interface. I'm going to go to Interface in the top left and select New Windows Interface Instance from a BAT file. If I'm not already there, I want to select the PyPC Interfaces RDBMSPI directory and select the RDBMSPI.bat_new. I'll need to select my PI server, and from the drop-down menu, I can select Walnut. And click OK. This will load the default settings for the RDBMSPI interface, but we're going to go through each view and check to make sure the settings are correct for our interface. The first thing I want to do is change the point source. I recommend using a point source that helps identify the data source that this interface is getting data from. So I'm going to call it RDB/SQL, since I'm going to be getting my data from a SQL database. I'm not going to configure anything for the scan frequencies yet. When we get around to creating tags, we can change those. The next thing I'm going to check is my connection to my PI server. I already selected Walnut as my PI server, but I'm going to make sure that all the trusts are in place so this interface will be able to connect. I'm going to go to my PI server, Walnut, and open up PI System Management Tools. And go to Security, Mappings and Trusts, and select the Trust tab. Best practice is to create trusts based on the computer name and the application we are using. And we'll need 2 trusts, one for API connections and one for SDK connections. I'm going to right-click and create a new trust and give this trust the name Peanut RDBMS API Trust. I'm going to enter in my network path, which is peanut pischool.int, and the application name. For the API connection, I just need the first 4 letters of the executable followed by an E. So that will be RDBME. For the PI identity, I've already created a PI interfaces identity specifically for my interfaces to use and connect to. This identity has been given permissions just to the PI point table and to the PI data, digital state table. To make my trust for the SDK application, I'm just going to copy this and change the settings that I need to change, such as the name and the application information. For trusts for SDK connections, I need to use the full executable name. And select OK. Now that I have my trusts in place, I'm going to go back to Peanut to continue configuring my interface. For now, I'm done with the General tab, and so I'm going to select UniInit to set some of these settings. I'm going to select API connection name and type in RDBM to make sure that this is what gets sent to the Pi server for my API trust. I'm also going to include the point source in the header of log messages, as this will help me out if I decide to have more than one instance of the interface. I'm now going to go to RDB ODBC to configure the settings for this particular instance of the interface. I have the startup parameters, recovery parameters, which I'll configure for history recovery, optional parameters, which I can set for connecting to my relational database or configuring the number of logs, and debug parameters, which I would set when I want to troubleshoot the interface. I'm going to go back to my Startup Parameters tab. At the top, we can define the interface log file. The RDBMSPI interface logs its connection to the ODBC data source and relational database, and any additional logging set with the debug parameters to its own log file. I need to correct this because, as I've mentioned before, I'm running on a 64-bit machine and my RDBMSPI directory is in the x86 directory. The log files by default are going into the log folder in the RDBMSPI directory and named rdbmspi.out. I might want to consider changing either the directory and or the name of the output file if I have more than one instance of the RDBMSPI interface. I also have a directory for my SQL files. If my SQL query is too long to put into the PyTag configuration, I can put it into a .sql file and into this directory, where it will be read by the interface. I also need to put this in the x86 directory. And finally, I can point to my data source connection in the DSN settings here. We haven't yet created a data source, so we'll do that now. If I were running on a 32-bit server, I could just go to the ODBC Data Source Administrator in the Administrative Tools. However, since I'm running on a 64-bit machine, this will open up a 64-bit Data Source Administrator. Since my RDBMSPI interface is a 32-bit application, I need to use the 32-bit ODBC Data Source Administrator. To open that administrator, I'm going to open up Windows Explorer and go to C, Windows, syswow64 directory, and find the ODBC AD32 executable. I'll double click on that to open it up. I'm going to go to the System DSN tag. I need to create a system data source name so that the data source name can be used by any user and not just the one I'm logged on as. I'll click Add, and I'm presented with a list of all the drivers that are available to me on this server. Microsoft has already included several drivers for connecting to other databases, such as the Microsoft Access driver, or Paradox, or the SQL Server. If you're connecting to another relational database that doesn't have a driver already, you will need to install that driver. I'm going to give my data source a name and define which SQL Server I'm connecting to. In this screen, I'm asked how I would like to authenticate with the SQL Server. I have the option of authenticating with a SQL Server username and password. However, I'm going to use Windows NT authentication, which uses a Windows Active Directory account. If I've gotten to this screen, it means I've been able to successfully connect to my SQL Server. Otherwise, I would see an error message indicating why I wasn't able to connect. I'm now going to set the default database to the database that I'm going to get data out of, which is called cluster info in this case. I'm going to click Next and Finish and accept all the other defaults. I'm going to test my data source one more time to make sure I can connect and click OK. I'm now going to go back to the ICU and click the ellipses button next to the DSN dialog. I'm going to go to the Machine Data Source tab and select my data source that I just created. Since I'm using a Windows authentication, I'll just use the trusted connection now and click OK. I am going to enter in the username and password that I'm using to connect to the data source and click Apply, and I get a message that my password is being saved to an encrypted file. The next thing I need to do is create the service, so I'll go to the service view. I need to change my logon user as the user that I'm connecting to my SQL Server. I'm going to use the auto startup mode and create the service. Now that the service is created, I'm going to check that it can start up and connect to the relational database. I'm going to open up the PyMessage log window and start the interface with the green arrow button. And I can see, if I scroll up through the log messages, that I was able to connect to my data source as PySchool administrator. And my interface is now ready to have tags assigned to it. The last thing I want to do is configure buffering for my interface. To configure buffering, I'm going to go to Tools, Buffering, and enable buffering with the PyBuffer subsystem. I'm now going to go to Buffered Servers to define Walnut as a buffered Pi server. I'll click Apply, and then go to the PyBuffer subsystem service view and start my PyBuffer subsystem. Once I've started buffering, I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to set my RDBMSPI interface to have a dependency on the PyBuffer subsystem. So I can scroll through the services and find PyBuff SS and restart my interface. To verify that I've got buffering configured correctly, I'm going to open up a command prompt and navigate to the PyHome bin directory. This will take me to Program Files x86 PyPC bin. Then I'll type in pybuff ss-cfg. And I can see that I'm connected to Walnut, and then I'm registered and ready to create tags for the RDBMSPI interface.